"This is where it breaks," she said quietly. Her voice, calm, precise, unafraid, cut through the room like a blade. The explanation that followed was not loud, nor dramatic, but clinical. A recursive decimal error, a rounding anomaly repeated across shell accounts. An impossibility unless someone had been siphoning money for years. The lieutenants froze. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Do-hyun watched from his chair as his most trusted advisor went pale, sweat beading at his temple. The man opened his mouth and closed it again. Across the table, the guards stiffened, hands hovering closer to concealed weapons. Not because the maid was a threat, but because the truth was. All because of her. All because of Lupita Haddish, the woman everyone overlooked, everyone ignored. Well, everyone dismissed, until she opened her mouth and spoke in the cold, exact language of forensic accounting. A dialect of numbers so pure it stripped a decade of betrayal bare in a single breath. They had thought she was nothing. They were wrong. Lupita Haddish knew the weight of invisibility better than anyone in the room. At 31, she had perfected the art of being a shadow in a service uniform. A woman caught between a brilliant past and a silent present. The rules had always been simple. Be invisible, be silent, be nothing. Estate managers repeated it like scripture. Powerful men preferred their surroundings compliant and forgettable, especially the people who served them. To Do-hyun's organization, Lupita was background furniture. Another maid meant to clear tea trays and arrange flowers, while men decided the fates of millions. They saw the white apron, the lowered gaze, the practiced deference. They did not see the woman who had once unraveled financial conspiracies in glass-walled boardrooms. 10 years ago, Lupita had been a top-tier forensic accountant, the kind firms fought over, the kind prosecutors quietly relied on, until she uncovered a truth so dangerous it cost her family everything. That night had taught her the final lesson her education never had. Numbers could expose power, but power always struck back. So she buried her name, her credentials, her future. She fled into invisibility. Over the past decade, she had worked 17 service jobs, always choosing positions where no one learned your story and no one remembered your face. It was the perfect cover for a woman who could dismantle a billion-dollar empire with a pencil and a calculator. Ms. Do-hyun's estate was the most dangerous place she had ever worked, and the safest. A fortress of cold marble and minimalist design, crawling with security men in tailored jackets and hidden weapons. They never looked at her face. They only saw the uniform. Lupita moved through the corridors like a ghost, hands steady, steps measured. They hadn't shaken in years, not since the night she buried her old life. While others lowered their eyes in fear, she observed, she memorized patterns, moods, security rotations. She listened. The staff meetings were masterclasses in terror. The estate manager paced, sweating through silk as he reminded them of Do-hyun's reach. Any mistake, any hint of disrespect, and losing their job would be the least of their worries. Lupita always stood at the back, silent, unreadable, her expression a mask honed by necessity. No one noticed that she understood the numbers better than the boss's own advisors. No one noticed until it was too late. Standing in the study now, with every eye finally on her, Lupita felt something she hadn't allowed herself in years. Not fear, but inevitability. Invisibility had kept her alive, but truth once spoken could never be unseen. And Do-hyun had just learned exactly who had been cleaning his floors. Fate has a way of mocking the most careful precautions, and for Lupita, it happened during a routine sweep of Do-hyun's private study. The room was a sanctuary of cold glass and heavy mahogany, still thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the lingering tension of a meeting that had clearly ended in frustration. In the trash bin beside the desk was overflowing with shredded documents and discarded memos, the physical remnants of a criminal empire's daily grind. As she bent to empty it, a corner of a leather binding caught the light, wedged beneath a pile of coffee-stained printouts. It was a ledger, its spine cracked, looking as though it had been hurled against a wall before being tossed into the waste. Lupita's training as a forensic accountant was a dormant predator, and the sight of the book triggered an instinct she thought she had finally killed. She knew she should ignore it. She had been given strict instructions to be nothing and to see nothing. But as she gathered the trash, the book fell open. revealing rows of handwritten figures and cryptic annotations in the margins. To any other maid, it would have been gibberish. To Lupita, and it was a map. Her eyes scanned the columns with practiced efficiency, and within seconds her mind began to flag the anomalies. There was a rhythm to the entries that was fundamentally wrong, a recursive decimal error that appeared every 3 pages, like a stutter in a heartbeat. It was a signature she recognized from her former life, a ghosting algorithm used to mask the siphoning of funds into a secondary offshore account. This wasn't just a lost book. It was the missing ledger the inner circle had been whispering about for weeks. She tucked the book beneath a stack of discarded linens, her hands steady despite the sudden spike of adrenaline. She moved through the rest of the house with the same quiet grace, her face remaining a mask of submissiveness, even as her mind raced through the implications. Because someone very close to Do-hyun was not just stealing, they were dismantling him from the inside. Back in the cramped solitude of her service quarters, Lupita sat on the edge of her bed and opened the ledger once more. She pulled a pencil from her hair and began to work on the back of a grocery receipt, her fingers flying as she reconstructed the trail of breadcrumbs the thieves thought they had buried. The scale of the betrayal was staggering. Millions of dollars diverted over 5 years, hidden behind a complex shell game that even the most loyal advisors had failed to catch. She had spent 10 years trying to stay invisible to stay safe, but looking at the mathematical bloodbath on the pages before her, she realized that the truth was a target she could no longer hide from. The morning air in Do-hyun's study was thick with the suffocating weight of failure. Lupita entered silently, her eyes downcast as she carried a fresh tea service, playing the role of the invisible servant to perfection. Around the mahogany desk, the atmosphere was a masterclass in fear. Do-hyun sat like a stone monolith, his neck tattoo stark against his white collar, while his two most trusted lieutenants, Minho and Sato, sweated through their designer suits. They were arguing over a series of unfortunate investment losses in the New York docks, losses that were bleeding the organization dry. "The numbers don't lie, boss," Minho insisted, his voice cracking with a forced sincerity. "The market shifted. It was bad luck, nothing more." Lupita moved toward the desk to clear the dregs of the previous hour's tension. As she reached for a discarded cup, her gaze fell upon the open spread of the current month's projections. The official books meant to explain away the missing millions. The irony wasn't lost on her. These were the same men who had looked through her for months, treating her as nothing more than a shadow in a white apron. But the ghosting algorithm she had decoded the night before was screaming from the page. It was a recursive decimal error, a signature of embezzlement so subtle it looked like a rounding mistake to the untrained eye. Before her survival instinct could intervene, the silence of a decade broke. "It wasn't the market," Lupita said, her voice soft, but possessing a clinical, authoritative edge that cut through the room like a blade. The room went deathly silent. It was a frozen moment of absolute shock, with the kind that precedes violence. Do-hyun's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Minho and Sato stared, their expressions shifting from confusion to a murderous alarm. "What did you say?" Do-hyun asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Lupita didn't shrink away. She stepped forward, her finger coming to rest on a specific line of the ledger. "You're being robbed, sir," she stated, her tone devoid of the submissive lilt expected of her. "This isn't bad luck. It's a ghosting algorithm. Every third transaction is being truncated, and the fragments are being diverted to a secondary routing transit. You've been losing 4% of your gross revenue for 5 years. It's a mathematical bloodbath." The silence that followed was charged with a decade of history and the sudden realization of betrayal. Minho reached for a weapon that wasn't supposed to exist in the study, but Do-hyun raised a hand, silencing his men without looking at them. He stared at the woman in the maid's uniform, seeing the mask slip to reveal the genius beneath. "Where did a maid learn to speak the language of forensic warfare?" he demanded. "The same place I learned to survive people like you," Lupita replied, meeting his gaze directly. "By knowing when to stay silent and knowing exactly when the numbers make silence impossible." Do-hyun looked down at the page, then back at Lupita. The hierarchy of the house had shifted in a single breath. The person cleaning his floors was the only one who could see the knife in his back. Do-hyun didn't move. He didn't reach for his weapon or bark an order for his guards to seize her. Instead, he stared at the ledger as if the ink were beginning to bleed. The air in the room grew thin, the silence heavy with the collective indrawing of breath from the men who had spent years treating Lupita as a ghost. "Explain," Do-hyun commanded, his voice a low, a vibrating chord of restrained fury. Lupita stepped closer, the white of her maid's apron stark against the dark mahogany of the desk. She didn't hesitate. The fear that had kept her hidden for a decade was eclipsed by the sheer clinical clarity of the fraud. "Look at the rounding on the international transit fees," she said, her voice steady and devoid of its former submissiveness. "Standard accounting would balance these to the nearest cent. But here, the software is being forced to truncate the third decimal place. It's less than a penny per transaction. You wouldn't notice it on a single sheet." She flipped the pages back, the paper snapping in the quiet room. "But your organization processes 10,000 microtransactions a day across your shell companies. One of those fractions of a cent are being routed into a dormant account listed here as maintenance contingency. It's a classic salami slicing technique, but it's been paired with a recursive loop. Every time you try to audit the total, the loop resets the display figures to match your expectations." Do-hyun leaned forward, his eyes tracking her finger as she pointed out the discrepancies. His face was a mask of stone, but the vein in his temple began to throb. Behind him, Sato's hand moved toward his jacket, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his cheek. "You're saying my own system is lying to me?" Do-hyun asked. "I'm saying the system was built to lie to you," Lupita corrected. "By the time the money hits your main accounts, 4% is already gone. Over 5 years. Factoring in the compound interest and the volume of your New York operations, we aren't talking about a few missing cases of liquor or a shorted shipment. You've been robbed of over $64 million. The number hit the room like a physical blow. 64 million. It was enough to fund a coup. It was enough to buy a dozen politicians. It was enough to start a war. Do-hyun stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a dying scream. He looked at Minho and Sato, his gaze now predatory. The two men who had been his loyal advisors for years suddenly looked very small. "A mathematical bloodbath," Do-hyun repeated, the words tasting like copper in his mouth. He turned back to Lupita, his expression unreadable. "You found what my best accountants, my Ivy League lawyers, and my most trusted brothers couldn't, or wouldn't, see. You've been scrubbing my floors while watching my empire bleed to death. I was paid to clean," Lupita said, her eyes meeting his without a hint of apology. "But I was born to count." Do-hyun reached out, not to strike her, but to slide the ledger toward her. "Count everything," he whispered, "because if you're right, this room is about to get a lot bloodier than the books." The transition from ghost to centerpiece was instantaneous and jarring. By sunset, Lupita was no longer permitted to touch a broom or a tea tray. Instead, Do-hyun had moved her into the glass office, a high-security observation suite on the top floor of his estate. It was a room of transparency and terror, and a walled entirely in reinforced glass that allowed Do-hyun to watch her every move from the corridor while she sat, surrounded by the digitized archives of a criminal empire. She was not alone. Two of Do-hyun's personal enforcers stood like statues at the door, their hands never straying far from the holsters concealed beneath their jackets. Outside the glass, the atmosphere of the house had turned toxic. Lupita could see the silhouettes of Minho and Sato pacing the gardens below, their heads bowed in urgent, conspiratorial whispers. She was the witness who could bury them, and the glass walls that were meant to protect her felt increasingly like a display case for a target. "You have 48 hours, Do-hyun's voice crackled over the room's intercom. He was standing on the other side of the glass, his silhouette sharp against the hallway lights. "I want every routing number, every ghost account, and every name attached to that 64 million. If you find a discrepancy in the discrepancy, you tell me first. No one else." Lupita didn't look up from the 3 monitors glowing in front of her. She had shed the white apron, but she still wore the black dress of her uniform, a reminder of the invisibility she had lost. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with a speed that made the guards exchange uneasy glances. To them, she was performing a dark magic. To her, she was finally speaking her native tongue. The data was a labyrinth of deceit. As she waded through encrypted spreadsheets and offshore wire transfers, the scale of the inside circle's betrayal became even clearer. They hadn't just been skimming, they had been building a parallel infrastructure. For every dollar Do-hyun earned in narcotics and extortion, a shadow dollar was being laundered through a chain of legitimate front dry cleaners and construction firms she had never seen on the official books. The emotional toll of the work began to settle in her bones. Each successful query brought her closer to a truth that would inevitably end in more blood. She remembered the fire 10 years ago, the way the smoke had smelled when the men in suits decided her family's accounting firm knew too much. Now she was the one holding the match. Around midnight, one of the guards moved, the leather of his holster creaking in the silence. Lupita paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the reflection of Sato in the glass, standing just behind the guard, his eyes burning with a desperate, murderous intensity. He didn't enter. He simply stared at her, a silent promise of what would happen the moment Do-hyun looked away. Lupita took a slow breath, turned back to the screen, and highlighted a new set of suspicious transfers. She was no longer a maid, and she was no longer safe, but as the numbers aligned, she realized she was finally the one in control of the ending. The hum of the server racks was the only sound in the glass office until the heavy door clicked open. It was 3 a.m., the hour of desperate men. Lupita didn't turn around. She watched the reflection in her monitor as Minho stepped into the room. He had discarded his jacket, his silk shirt damp with the sweat of a man who knew he was walking toward a gallows of his own making. Sir, the guards at the door had conveniently stepped away, a silence bought with a favor or a threat. Minho didn't approach the desk. He stood by the glass looking out at the dark estate, as if seeing it for the last time. "You're very good, Lupita," he said, his voice a jagged whisper. "Better than any of us realized. But numbers are flexible things. They're like memories. They can be edited if the price is right." He placed a velvet-lined box on the edge of the glass table. Inside sat a cold, heavy watch and a series of offshore bank routing numbers written on a slip of paper. "There is $2 million in that account, more than you'd make in 3 lifetimes of cleaning floors. All you have to do is find a different error. Blame the software. Blame the international exchange rates. Give Do-hyun a ghost to chase, honor, and you can walk out of here tonight. My men will ensure you disappear, truly disappear, with enough money to never work again." Lupita finally turned her chair. The glow of the monitors caught the sharp lines of her face, making her look less like a maid and more like a judge. "You think I'm hiding because I'm poor, Minho?" she asked, her voice chillingly calm. "I didn't lose my family to a bad exchange rate. I lost them to men like you who thought they could balance their books with blood." Minho's face contorted, the mask of the benefactor slipping to reveal the predator beneath. He stepped forward, slamming his hand onto the desk, inches from her keyboard. "Listen to me, you arrogant bitch. You're sitting in a glass box. Do-hyun is a monster, and when he's done using you to find his money, he'll discard you just like I discarded that ledger. If you don't take the money, you're just a dead maid who happened to be good at math." He leaned in close, the scent of expensive cologne and cheap fear rolling off him. "Change the names on those transfers. Give him Sato. Give him the managers. But leave my accounts out of it, or I'll make sure the last thing you count is the seconds it takes for this room to fill with smoke." Lupita looked down at the velvet box, then back up at him. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached out and pushed the box back toward him. "The problem with the salami slicing fraud, Minho, is that it leaves a digital trail of every cut. I've already sent the encrypted backup of the real files to a remote server. If I stop breathing, the password goes to Do-hyun's personal phone." She turned back to her monitors, the clicking of her keys sounding like the cocking of a hammer. "You're not bribing me and you're not threatening me. You're just proving that I'm right. Now get out. I have 24 million more to find, and your name is on every cent of it." The silence following Minho's departure was heavier than the darkness outside the glass. Lupita's fingers didn't stop, but her mind was no longer merely auditing. She was hunting. She began to cross-reference the timestamps of the diverted funds with external events, looking for the why behind the 64 million. Pure greed usually left a trail of luxury, yachts, real estate, or high-stakes gambling debts. But as she dug deeper into the maintenance contingency account, she found no such indulgences. Instead, the money was flowing outward in jagged, purposeful bursts. Her eyes narrowed as she pulled up a series of encrypted wire transfers to a security firm based out of Eastern Europe, a company that existed only as a front for high-end mercenaries. Then came the procurement records, untraceable short-range communication arrays, tactical gear, and a specific type of high-velocity ammunition that bypassed standard body armor. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The numbers weren't just being stolen, they were being weaponized. This wasn't a retirement fund for a disgruntled lieutenant. This was a war chest. Lupita leaned back, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in her wide, dark eyes. She began to map the logistics. The final payout from the ghosting account had been triggered 48 hours ago. The exact moment Do-hyun's arrival at the estate had been confirmed. The funds had been used to hire a cleaning crew of professional assassins who were likely already in position. The robbery was the prologue to a coup. She looked at the digital clock on her screen. 4:12 a.m. In the stillness of the early morning, the quiet of the estate felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Every shadow in the hallway, every guard standing at the periphery of the glass, each was a variable she could no longer trust. If Minho and Sato were funding an assassination, they wouldn't wait for her to finish the audit. They were likely waiting for the moment Do-hyun felt most secure, the moment he believed his loyal accountants had solved his problems. A sudden chill raced down her spine as she saw a final, pending transaction. It was a GPS-linked trigger set to activate when a specific mobile device entered a geofence zone within the house. Do-hyun's study. Lupita's breath hitched. She had spent a decade being invisible to stay alive, but the numbers were telling her that her silence was now a death sentence for everyone in the house, including herself. She stood up, her chair screeching against the floor, drawing the immediate sharp attention of the guards. She had to get to Do-hyun. She had to show him that the mathematical bloodbath she had discovered was about to become a literal one. The invisible maid was gone. In her place was a woman who knew that the only thing more dangerous than a man with a gun was a woman who had already calculated the trajectory of the bullet. The geofence trigger on Lupita's monitor turned a violent, pulsing red. The countdown didn't just represent numbers. It was the heartbeat of a dying house. "He's in the study," she whispered, the realization chilling her blood. She turned to the glass, shouting for the guards, but the hallway was empty. The loyal enforcers had vanished, replaced by the heavy, ominous silence of a vacuum. Lupita didn't waste time with the door. She grabbed a heavy bronze award from the desk and swung with a decade's worth of repressed rage, shattering the glass wall. The explosion of shards echoed like a gunshot, but she was already moving, her black maid's shoes silent on the plush carpet. She knew the invisible geography of the estate better than the men who owned it. She didn't take the main stairs. She dove into the service lift, a cramped steel box that smelled of industrial floor wax and secrets. She burst into the study just as Do-hyun was reaching for his phone. "Drop it!" she screamed. "The GPS trigger is live!" Do-hyun froze, his hand hovering inches from the device. In the shadows behind him, the heavy velvet curtains rippled. A tactical laser dot, small and crimson as a drop of blood, danced across the mahogany desk. Before Do-hyun could speak, Lupita tackled him, her momentum throwing the massive man behind the reinforced oak credenza just as the first high-velocity round shattered the window. The air filled with the smell of ozone and pulverized stone. "The kitchen service tunnel," Lupita gasped, her voice sharp and clinical despite the chaos. "They've compromised the main security feed. Minho and Sato are moving through the front entrance with a mercenary team. We have 90 seconds before they flank the study." Do-hyun looked at the woman who had spent months cleaning his ashtrays, now barking tactical orders with the precision of a field commander. He drew a suppressed handgun from his waistband, his expression hardening. "Why are you helping me, Lupita?" "Because the numbers have to balance," she snapped, one pulling a hidden latch beneath the floorboards, a service hatch used for plumbing maintenance that she had scouted weeks ago. "And you're the only one left who can sign the warrant for their execution?" They dropped into the narrow, damp dark of the service tunnels. It was a labyrinth of pipes and wires, the veins of the house that the elite never deigned to see. Lupita led the way, navigating by the sound of the ventilation fans and the heat of the water lines. Above them, the muffled thud of boots and the staccato rhythm of gunfire signaled the fall of the estate. "Left at the junction," she whispered, her hand finding a rusted handle. "It leads to the old carriage house. I've had a vehicle staged there for 3 days." "You planned for this?" Do-hyun asked, his breath heavy in the dark. "I'm a forensic accountant." "Sir," Lupita replied, pushing the door open to reveal the cool night air. "I don't just find the theft. I calculate the risk of the fallout." As they slipped into the shadows of the garage, the estate behind them erupted into flames. The final edit to the books. The maid and the boss were gone, vanished into the night, leaving the traders to count their spoils in a house of ashes. The safe house in the industrial heart of the city was a mirror of Lupita's hidden soul. It was a nondescript loft, but inside the walls were covered in the true architecture of Do-hyun's empire. Flowcharts, surveillance logs, and secondary ledgers that detailed every cent siphoned by the traders. Do-hyun stood in the center of the room, the flickering blue light of a dozen monitors illuminating his face. He wasn't looking at the screens. He was looking at the woman who had transformed from a ghost into his most lethal weapon. The purge was clinical. Using the encrypted backdoor Lupita had installed, Do-hyun froze the offshore accounts she had identified, rendering Minho and Sato's mercenary army instantly penniless. Within the hour, the inside circle was paralyzed. The betrayal that had taken 5 years to build was dismantled in 60 minutes of precise mathematical warfare. As the reports came in, of Minho being intercepted at the border and Sato being found in a Newark basement, Do-hyun finally turned to Lupita. "They thought they were stealing money," Do-hyun said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "They didn't realize they were stealing from someone who knew exactly how much the debt was worth." He walked to the large oak table in the center of the room and placed a single leather-bound book upon it. It wasn't the old discarded ledger. It was a new one, pristine, heavy, and waiting for a signature. He pushed it toward her, along with a pen made of cold, heavy silver. "I spent a decade being invisible," Lupita said, looking at the book but not yet touching it. Her voice was no longer the soft murmur of a servant. It was the sharp, clear tone of the woman who had survived the fire 10 years ago. "I didn't do this for your money, Do-hyun. I did it because I'm tired of watching people like them think they can erase the truth with a rounding error." "Then don't be invisible anymore," Do-hyun replied. He stepped back, Shira conceding the head of the table to her. "The maid is dead. The auditor is here. From this moment on, no dollar moves in this city without your thumbprint on it. You aren't part of the background, Lupita. You are the foundation." Lupita sat. She picked up the pen, the weight of it familiar and right in her hand. For 10 years, she had hidden her brilliance in the shadows of service, polishing the floors of men who weren't worthy to speak her name. Now the mask was gone forever. She opened the first page of the new ledger and began to write. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and permanent. She was no longer a shadow in a white apron. She was the one who kept the count. And in the world of blood and business, the one who knows the numbers is the one who owns the world. As Do-hyun watched her work, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a subordinate. He was looking at his equal. The ledger was balanced, the debt was paid, and a new empire was being born in the quiet click of a pen.